Hi guys, gonna read chapter 25. It's unfortunately like take number 7 because my kids seem to sense when I'm reading to you and need all the things. I'm sure you guys aren't like that with your parents. A few pages in the enormous journal, and the word ladder is pages, wages, waves, wives, wines, wines, and fines. By late morning the next day, after Elizabeth had spent 2 hours sledding by herself, she returned to the library. The book, how she'd caused it to move in slowly developing string of silver letters, was nearly all she'd been thinking about since she'd awakened that morning. Although she was eager to repeat the exercise of the evening before, she told herself she would wait until evening to attempt it again. The incident needed time to work through her, and so she decided to pass as normal a day as possible. "Merry day after Christmas," Leona said from behind her desk when Elizabeth entered the library. "Summer's here," Miles called from his cage in the back room. "Summer's here." "Hi, Leona," Elizabeth said, and more loudly, "Hello to you too, Miles." "Hard to believe the big day has come and gone," Leona said. Elizabeth glanced around, letting her eyes linger on the top floor where she'd seen the crimson light 2 nights before. "Did the library make it through Christmas okay?" she asked as lightly as possible. "Some books had toppled off the shelves way up in the reference room when I checked things yesterday," Leona said. "But that sort of thing happens from time to time in this old hotel." She waved it off. "We're still open for business." Savannah. They caught up for a few minutes over tea in Leona's office before Elizabeth said, "Remember a few nights ago when we were talking in Norbridge's living room?" "Why, of course. When I mentioned that I'd seen the Himeses talking to Gracella's picture, it seemed to surprise you at Norbridge, and I've been wondering about Gracella ever since." "What makes you interested in her, dear?" Leona said. She suddenly became very serious. "I don't know exactly. I was just thinking about that picture, and then I heard Mr. Wellington and Mr. Rashput talk about her and saying that she got interested in magic, so I was just wondering." Leona looked away. "It's a disquieting fact about the Falls family that Gracella was always very odd." "Odd how?" "When she was a little girl, she wasn't so bad, apparently. I didn't know her then, of course, but that's what Norbridge says. But as she got older, she began to change, began to have a fascination for reading about, well, dark magic, spirits and powers and all those sorts of things. A lot of very dangerous investigation. I met her when she was 15. "Strange bird," Miles called. "Strange bird." Elizabeth laughed, but Leona remained serious. "Strange bird indeed," she said. She took a sip of tea and sat for a moment. "I think the real problem was that she became jealous of Norbridge. Their father wanted him to take over Winterhouse, which, as you see, is exactly what happened. I think Gracella felt that their father was playing favorites. When she turned 18, she left. She took a few possessions one winter night and left without saying a word. No one even saw her go. It seemed as though she had just disappeared." "Has anyone seen her since?" Elizabeth asked. "Never. But over the years, we've heard some strange things." Elizabeth waited for Leona to continue. "We thought she was just a fairly regular, if disagreeable, young woman who became estranged from her family, but it seems that her hatred for Winterhouse and Norbridge and all of the Falls family just sat inside her and grew. We heard that she traveled, boys." Sorry, guys. "We heard she traveled to many places to learn more about magic. Someone once told us she wanted to learn the secret of immortality so that she could live forever. She even married an older man named Alistair Winters. Strange coincidence, isn't it? Her name became Gracella Winters." "I saw that on the family tree," Elizabeth said, "where it says she was an enigma." "Yes, that's right," Leona said. "An enigma for sure. Anyway, there you have it, the whole strange story. According to rumors, she passed away at least 25 or 30 years ago. We don't know what happened to her husband, and as far as we know, she never had any children." She gave Elizabeth a sad smile. "Goodness, I hope I haven't frightened you." Elizabeth didn't know what to say or make of what she'd heard. Before she could think of anything, Leona pointed to a lectern at the back of her office. There, sitting open upon a reading stand, lay a thick volume that Elizabeth hadn't noticed before. It reminded her of a dictionary. "You seem very interested in the history of this old hotel." I should have told you about this book before. It's one of a kind, personal account of Winterhouse written by one of Norbridge's relatives, Marshall Falls. He was quite an eccentric, but my, did he love to write. Elizabeth eyed the thick journal. That book looks huge. It's his very own journal filled with drawings and photographs. Everything you would ever want to know about Winterhouse is in there, at least from old Marshall's unique perspective. Elizabeth wanted to jump up and examine the book immediately. You must have seen so many things here over the years, I can't even imagine. Leona nodded. Winterhouse is a special place, a very special place. Like what Norbridge said the other night about how people like to come here? Exactly. But it's so much more than that, I believe. Norbridge might not ever say this aloud, but I will. To me, Winterhouse isn't just a place where people come to enjoy themselves or eat good meals or have fun. I mean, certainly it is all that, but it's so much more too. When people come here, they take something away with them, just like when you go to a beautiful museum or a wonderful park for the afternoon. At least that's what I believe. Sorry, I have to look and make sure I count 1, 2, 3 in the backyard, and I do. Oh, Elizabeth thought back to the way she'd felt her first evening at Winterhouse after she'd been astounded by her initial view of the hotel, and then the things Norbridge had shown her as he'd walked her to her room. Above all, she thought of how she'd felt when during those first few minutes in room 213, she parted the curtains and gazed out at Lake Luna and the mountains beyond. I think I know what you mean, she said. I'm a very biased old librarian, I'll confess, but I believe Winterhouse is one of those places in this world that isn't just to be enjoyed, but that actually increases the amount of goodness that exists. She widened her eyes as if to make light just a tiny bit of how momentous it all sounded, although her point had been absolutely sincere. So hooray for Winterhouse in my estimation. Norbridge sure has a lot to keep him busy, Elizabeth said. He does an amazing job. Elizabeth looked down, plucked at the sleeve of her sweater. She was thinking about Freddie again, and how maybe she had been the one to cause the difficulties between them. You and Norbridge have been friends all these years, she said, and Leona nodded. Did you ever disagree about anything, like have fights or arguments? Leona let out a small laugh. Well, of course, dear. That's par for the course. Two people will never think exactly alike, no matter how much they care for each other. She hesitated, waited a moment for Elizabeth to speak, and then went on. But we always work things out because we care about each other, and Norbridge is the best friend I could have ever hoped for. Leona glanced through the door to her office. A woman was standing by the card catalog looking confused. I'd better go, assist my customers, she said as she stood to walk out. She pointed to the thick journal on the stand behind her. But feel free to delve into that old book. Elizabeth set a small step stool in front of the reading stand, perched herself on it, and began to examine Marshall's book. It was enormous, over 500 pages and entirely handwritten, though professionally bound like some old Bible or ancient encyclopedia. A personal history of the Winterhouse Hotel was written on the facing page in an ornate, meticulous style, and beneath it by Marshall Falls, inhabitant. Elizabeth turned to chapter 1 and began to read. For millennia, the wind-swept shores of Lake Luna sat bare and open in the indifferent natural forces of nature, unvisited by man or woman or child or anyone at all, awaiting the coming of that illustrious supernova of his generation and all others, my grand uncle, Nestor Falls. It was Nestor himself who, upon seeing Lake Luna for the first time, declared, I will build a hotel beside that lake, and then proceeded to do so, in answer to his own prophecy, as though responding to a promise he had made to himself to fulfill something he had indicated he would do. Another weird book, Elizabeth thought. She kept reading, however, found herself 3 pages in before she realized she was hopelessly lost, trying to follow a tangled story about Nestor Falls, a wounded caribou, a lost crate of long underwear, and a wandering barber. She began thumbing through the book. 200 pages in, she found a section about Gracella and learned she had been something of a recluse and a very unpleasant girl. Apparently she'd run away once when she was 13, and then returned after several days with no explanation of where she'd been. And another time, 3 years later, she'd had an altercation with a hotel guest who accused her of stealing jewelry that indeed turned up in Gracella's room. But of course she claimed to know nothing about. When she'd been old enough to leave Winterhouse, she vanished without a trace one winter night after a heated argument with her parents. Her cabin remained abandoned and untouched, even for years afterwards. Marshall noted, explaining that Gracella's father had had a small log cabin built for her along the western shore of Lake Luna in an attempt to provide a quiet haven to sort through her confusion as she passed through her teen years, but apparently it had not helped. It was her interest in things of magical nature, Marshall wrote, that seemed to tip her even more over to the difficult side and made her a difficult person with whom to have dealings. Why, there was one occasion I recall when I had some Easter candy. "Summer's here," Miles called from his cage. "Summer's here." Sorry, got him. Elizabeth turned back to the table of contents and examined headings such as "The Incident of the Flying Balloon" and "10 Weeks Without Hot Chocolate" and "The $1 Million Florschen Delivery." And then one of them seemed to leap out at her. "The Legend of the Book." Elizabeth turned to the chapter and began to read. "The first time I heard anyone at Winterhouse mention the book was when I was a boy of 9 or 10. I was in the library and my Uncle Milton said, 'Are you looking for the book?' And I told him I was looking for a book, and he asked me if it was the book. And I told him it was just a book that I was looking for, and so on, back and forth, until we clarified things. As I grew older, I heard relatives mention the book at various times, so I finally asked my father by saying, 'What is the book?' And he explained it to me. He said there was supposedly one book somewhere in the library here at Winterhouse that was special. This was a legend or tale or story that the older generation knew about. The book had some sort of message or puzzle in it, and there was something very special about that. I don't know just what the special thing was, but supposedly it would be a very special challenge to figure it out. The only thing that was that no one knew which book was the book. No one knew anything about it or had any clues. As often as I heard my relatives here at Winterhouse mention the book, there were never any details forthcoming about the title, say, or the color, or the shape, or the size of the book, about whether or not it was thin or thick, or whether it was about animals or boats or anything, and no one seemed to know. No details at all. Another part of the legend was that only someone in the Falls family with true faith could find it. And so every time a new child was born here, by the time they were 4 or 5 or so, we would have them wander around the library and pick out a book, hoping it would be the book. It was all sort of a joke, a lark, you might say, something to do for fun and as a way to pass the time or have a laugh. But here's the thing, if no one knew what the book looked like, then how would we know if it had been found? So some people said the book wasn't ready to be found, and others said there wasn't really anything like the book at all. Some people said maybe the person with true faith wasn't the one we thought, and someone else in the family who we didn't think was the person really was the person. So there were always many, many complications to this strange legend, and I never knew what to believe or what not to believe. Over the years, I came to believe it was all just a story told to make, sorry about the slurping in the background, told to make the library seem more romantic and interesting. Of course, anything having to do with charms and magic was very interesting to Gracella, and I noticed she was always asking about the book and seemed very interested in it. I remember she would sometimes spend whole days just looking through the shelves to see if maybe somehow she could find the book. Which makes me think of a time when I was very young, maybe 8 or 9 or perhaps younger, and a group of us played a game of hide and seek in the library. "Strange bird," Miles called. "Strange bird, strange bird." He was calling out so loudly and fluttering about on his stand with so much agitation that Elizabeth actually looked up from the journal and glanced through the open door of the office. Selina Heim stood there, her hand lifted in greeting. "Hello," Selina said, motioning to Elizabeth. "Do you have a moment? I'd like to speak to you." That takes us to chapter 26.